The Dialed In Angling Podcast, presented by Strike Master Augers, Onyx Fish, Arneson's Rocky Point Resort, and Visit Cook County. Well, this week, it's the beginning of June. I have been all over the map. I was up on Leech Lake at a Lund photo shoot. I'll get into that. I want to talk about June fishing, different techniques for June fishing as it pertains to walleyes, smallmouth bass. You know, June is one of those time periods that I look forward to all season long. It ranks right up there as like one of my favorite months to fish. It's right up there with early ice. It's right up there with spring fishing, fall fishing. June is one of those time periods where you can do no wrong, right? You go to a small body of water. There's panfish that are popping. Crappies are coming off their beds. You got big bluegills sliding in the shallows. Largemouth are coming off their beds. Smallmouth bass are coming off the spawn. You've got walleye starting to slide out to mid-lake structure. You got vegetation growing. You got bug hatches going on. There's a ton to talk about in June. I'll get into all of that. I want to talk about some of my favorite techniques for different species, what you can do and how you can do it to perfect these techniques, and you can do them on your own. Basically, to catch fish anywhere you go. I'm always this time of year, I've got all sorts of different presentations rigged up. This is the time of year that my boat is completely full with all sorts of tackle. I've got panfish gear in there. I've got bass gear. I've got topwater gear. I've got walleye gear. Obviously, I do a ton of walleye fishing guiding. You know, this week alone has been really fun just because things are really starting to happen. We're getting stable weather all over the Midwest. Yes, we've had some storms and some different things, but we've had really stable weather, coming off the last few weeks where we've been all over the map as far as weather and surface temperatures. Things are getting more stable. Surface temperatures starting to rise. In a lot of areas, we're seeing surface temps, upper 50s, close to 60s, a lot more consistent than we had the past few weeks. And so let's just start with me, kind of where I've fished this week. Once again, this week, I've been kind of all over the Brainerd area. I fished some small lakes for walleyes, for panfish. I spent a couple days with my kids up at the Lund photo shoot on Leech. I've been guiding on Mille Lacs as well. And everything seems to be kind of ironing out as far as consistency. If you listen to the podcast last week, the week before, when I talked to guides like Nate Blazing, I had some of my other guides on here, Nick Sakella, Mitch Hackemiller. It was kind of like pack everything in for walleyes. You don't know what to expect. Things are getting a lot more consistent. On Leech, it just seemed, let's just start with Leech, for example. Leech, it seemed like the shiner bite is sort of at the tail end, but very strong. I know that's the same thing for if you're going to Winnebagosh or Cass or Vermilion, but you're sort of nearing the end where the spot tail shiner run is sort of almost over here. And always it seems like that coincides with when that good shiner bite starts to slow down. But if you like jig fishing, one of my favorite things to do is pitch jigs and plastics, right? I love throwing jigs and plastics. Like, let's say my go-to jig head for fishing plastics, especially like a 3-inch or a 4-inch plastic, would be a moon eye jig. VMC moon eye jigs are great. They have that great rise fall. And the reason that they're so effective is for a couple reasons. One, you've got that aspirin head design, right? You've got the flat side. So that rise fall of that bait is far superior to any other round head jig. Number two, you've got the big eye on those moon eye jigs. I would say a close second to a moon eye jig would be the VMC sleek jig. Now that has a little bit longer shank. I tend to use those with some bigger baits, like a 4 or a 5-inch bait rigged on there. So, but let's just go back to the moon eye jig, the aspirin head design. I like tipping those with plastics, let's say like a paddle tail. My real go-tos for paddle tails are Crush City Mayors, right? They have a 3 and a 4-inch. And then it would be the Largo Shad. If you've never fished a storm Largo Shad, again, they just have that right rise fall to them. They have the right body profile, kind of that sleeker body profile. I know bass anglers, especially smallmouth bass anglers that are swimming paddle tails, they tend to go with like a bigger profile side bait, a more full paddle tail. But for me, it seems like if you're getting that snap jig reaction, especially out of walleyes, that Crush City Mayor is really hard to beat. What I love about Crush City Mayor too, it's super durable. You can fish a bait all day long. You don't have to worry about pike ripping that bait. You don't have to worry about bass sliding that bait down the shank. I throw a ton of Crush City. And then sort of that 1-2 punch would be the Crush City Largo, or I'm sorry, the Largo Shad. You know, it's made by Storm, but it's also a Rapala brand. And again, super lifelike. It's got a ton of action. That paddle tail gives you a lot of action. And I like fishing them with like a braid fluorocarbon combination because most of the lakes that I'm fishing have zebra mussels. They're super clear. And so I'll use like an Alberto knot with probably a 2.5, 3, maybe a 4-foot leader at the most, but something that I'm just really comfortable casting that. And then I tend to use like a 10-pound braid, like an 832 Suffix, 131 Gore type of braid, and then an Alberto knot. And then the Suffix, I like to use like a 10-pound fluorocarbon. That's sort of the combination that I like to use on a medium action rod. It might be medium fast, medium light, extra fast, something like that, where you can pitch that bait out there and you can rip it, let it hit the bottom, snap it, let it fall, snap it, let it fall. When you get into this time period where, you know, they're chasing the shiners, but they won't quite commit to it, I tell you what, you put a plastic on. If you want to get really good at plastic fishing, this is the time to do it. You can do it in vegetation. You can do it in rocks, sand, off the edges. But that cadence of snapping that bait is really important. And how I jig that bait isn't off to the side. I'll throw that out there. Let's say I'm using my forward-facing sonar or I'm just blind casting an edge. I'll throw that bait up onto the edge, let it fall, hit the bottom, snap it through them, and then let it fall until it momentarily touches the bottom. But when I'm ripping it straight up in the air. I see a lot of anglers make the mistake of ripping that bait off to the side. And what happens when you do that is your jig is basically just dribbling on the bottom. And when you're doing that, you're also going to get snagged more in the rocks. You're going to get snagged more in the vegetation. Whereas if you rise fall that bait and you snap it straight up in the air and then drop that rod tip down on a slack line, that's going to move through that vegetation really nicely, right? It's going to have that rise fall. You're not going to get hung up on cabbage. You're not going to get hung up on other vegetation. And when you're fishing a braid fluorocarbon, when you snap that bait, even if you get a little bit of vegetation on there, you can tend to just completely knock off any vegetation you have just by snapping it. But, you know, follow that cadence where you're ripping it straight up in the air. It is really going to help you. I know I do a ton of jig fishing, and I get to fish with a lot of other anglers that, you know, maybe just aren't that great at jigging or don't do enough of it. And when I walk them through those steps, they go from not catching fish to catching a ton of fish. And so it's really important to get that rise fall on those plastics. So if you're heading out to a small lake, you know, it's hard to beat a paddle tail. You're going to catch everything on it. You're going to catch largemouth bass. You're going to catch smallmouth. You're going to catch walleyes, pike. Everything loves that boot tail. If you're using forward-facing sonar in particular, or if you're fishing, you're not finding yourself catching fish on that, you're going to want to switch to a plastic that I also rely on a lot this time of year. And that would be like a jerk profile, like almost like a fluke or a minnow profile. Same 3-4 inch profile, matching the hatch, whether it's perch forage base. They make them that look like bluegills. What I like is a lot of shiner looking colors, especially if I'm fishing on leech or winnie or mille lacs. I love that kind of albino shad or shiner looking color if you can get those. I truly believe with, you know, because I fish a lot of clear lakes, I tend to use a lot of natural colored plastics. However, when I get up to Lake of the Woods, for example, rainy river, rainy lake, I will shift from some of those albinos, those whiter colors, to like an electric chicken or a chartreuse or something that's real bold, something that the fish can see in dark water, in stained water. That's kind of my mindset when I'm fishing plastics like that. So I would say 75 to 80% of my fishing is done on clear lakes now because of zebra mussels. And so I tend to fish more natural plastics and more natural colors than I do, let's say, the brighter colors. And same can be said about crankbaits, casting crankbaits, whether it's a shad wrap, casting jerk baits. I love casting hard baits, but I kind of fit that same mold in the sense where I'll use more natural colors on our clear lakes, and then I'll use the real brights, the fire tigers, the hot, the oranges, that sort of thing, whites on lakes that are a little more dark or a little more stained, even river systems. I know a lot of people like fishing lake river systems, Lake of the Woods, Vermilion, anywhere we've got a lot of color. I will go to those brighter baits, but more often not, just because the lakes I fish right now are more clear, I like the natural colors. So don't be afraid to try plastics. Again, if you want to get good at plastic fishing on a lake that you like fishing, all across the Midwest, don't be afraid to try plastics. I know a lot of people tend to look at plastics like, they're unsure. They kind of lean on that live bait all the time. Take it from me, someone that I would rather fish plastics than live bait. And for the most part, it's because of that fact that either they're following it, not hitting it, or, the shiners are getting kind of soft this time of year. If you can find shiners right now, which they're starting to get a little more scarce, you put a shiner on, you start snap jigging that, you'll see after one or two casts, that shiner starts to slide down the shank of the hook. There's nothing you can do about it. The shiners are soft, that they rip the body, they rip the lips. You put a plastic on there, now you get the desired action on the baits that you do not get with live bait. And so Crush City Mayor, Storm Largo shads, you're going to want to check them out. They're my go-tos for tipping with plastic. And then also one that I should note is like the Crush City freeloader. I do like fishing a freeloader, but that's more of a swimming presentation, which we're starting to get into. What I've noticed this week on leech, on Mille Lacs, starting to see some bug activity. Not big mayflies yet, but those smaller lake-style flies or lake hatches. Mille Lacs Lake in particular, leech, winnie, there's hundreds of different species of bugs that hatch throughout the season. Typically starting shortly after opener around Memorial Day, you'll get bug hatches all the way. I've seen it into October before, where you'll have a midge hatch in October. And so we get these bug hatches. When the bug hatches happen, fish start to move, okay? It drives bait fish. It drives walleye movement. And, there's always this debate whether walleyes eat bugs out of necessity because they're starving, or if it's just part of their diet. I think it's part of their diet. I've said it for years. I've cleaned thousands of fish throughout my career. And it always seems like when you get into this time of year, you start to get fish that have shiners in their stomach, obviously rusty crayfish if they're present in lakes, and then bugs. You'll see that kind of slimy, translucent material that's in there. Those are bugs, man. You'll see those bugs in their stomach, especially when you get into some bigger bug hatches like the hexagenias, which are big mayflies, those giant mayflies. They love them. It's a great protein source. It's easy for them to eat. Today I was on Mille Lacs and I noticed fish that were suspended off the edges, and I know they're feeding on bugs. And so, we quickly shift gears because, I was on leech yesterday and the day before. We were throwing jigs and shiners. We were throwing jigs and plastics. Today on Mille Lacs, I went to the bobbers. Anytime I see those fish suspended up in the water like that, I'm throwing a bait that's going to present that bait in their face. And it's a pretty easy rigging process, and how to kind of dial in the depth in which you should be fishing. Set it at the fish or above. I always fish above the fish with bobbers, especially on clear lakes like Mille Lacs. And so my setup for bobbers are pretty easy. It's either a plain hook or a 16th ounce jig tipped with a leech or a night crawler. I tend to use, let's say, like a 4 to 5 foot leader sometimes. It seems like the clearer the water, the longer the leader. One split shot, and then I'm using a swivel. Okay, so my whole length to my swivel is roughly 3 to 5 feet, depending on the conditions. Something that's comfortable to cast. And then above that swivel is a small egg sinker with a bead. There's some new products coming out from VMC that if you're a bobber fisherman that loves power bobbering or pitching on fish like this, there's a new product that's coming out from VMC that you're going to want to really have on your radar and keep in your back pocket right now. Because shortly they're going to announce this product. I've been testing them extensively. I'm not going to get into details of that product, but it's going to change your life when it comes to power corking and doing what we did today on Mille Lacs. So let's break down where I was fishing. I was fishing off the edges, some of these gravel bars, off the edges of some of these kind of mid-lake humps. The fish weren't on top. They were off the edges, but they were suspended. Some of the fish were as high as 6 feet below the surface. Some of the fish were 6 to 8 feet off bottom. And you really have to pay attention to this if you're going to be successful with catching fish. I'm not going to say on every cast because the bite's a little tougher out there as far as saying every cast. But if you want to be a real good, effective bobber fisherman, again, June's the time to do it. This is the time to do it. When these bug hatches start to happen, this is when you can really get your power fishing or your power bobber fishing or power corking presentations dialed in. And what I do is I tend to drive around with either forward-facing sonar on my trolling motor or in the back on a pole, and I'll drive around looking for these pods of fish. What I've noticed on leech, on Mille Lacs, on Winnie, on Cass, you have to try to keep your boat 50 to 60 feet away from these fish. If you're starting to get closer than 30 feet, for example, especially in under 20 feet of water, you're going to spook them. That water's so clear. They see the boat, they see you coming, they hear the motor, they hear the vibration from the trolling motor. So try to keep the fish out at about 50 feet. And then try to adjust your depth based on what you're seeing on your graph. Okay? If you have a forward-facing sonar unit, here's how I do it. I'll set my bobber out, let's say 5 feet from the transducer. I'll watch my presentation fall down. It's really nice when you have like that egg sinker on there because you can follow that down and then you can follow your jig down. And I'll set the depth of my bobber stop based on where I'm seeing the fish or above. So if most of them are at 12 feet, rather than doing 2 arm lengths and guessing at what my depth is, I set it with my transducer. And so I'll drop it down. I'll watch where it's sitting. If I need to adjust up or down from there, I do so. I throw in that pack of fish. Okay, you catch one, they get spooked, or you don't catch one if they're not biting. You move to the next pack. Now I'm carefully watching to see at what depth those fish are, right? Because I just set my depth, like, for example, if the fish are at 12 feet, I just set my depth at, let's say, 10 and a half. I kept it about 1.5 feet above them because some of them might be at 11, some might be at 12, some might be at 13. So I kind of find that happy median where to set the depth on that cork and bobber stop, and then I pitch it out there. If I catch fish, great. I start to look for more packs, right? I don't just spot lock and sit there and wait for them to come in. There was times today where the fish were cruising, where I could spot lock and I could pick off different fish as they came through, especially when the wind picked up. But other times when the wind laid down, I was basically just hunting fish. I would go to the next pot of fish, look for them, assess at what depth they were. If they were a little bit deeper, I would move my slip bobber just a little bit. If they were a little shallower, I would do the same. I would adjust on the fly. And if you adjust on the fly as you're moving around looking for these fish, you're going to catch more fish on a bobber. Guaranteed. It's just the way it is now. It's kind of the nature of the beast. Obviously, if you don't have forward-facing sonar, side imaging, you can kind of do the same thing. Or if you're seeing them on 2D sonar, you're seeing the height at which these fish are sitting in the water column. You can also adjust your depth with your 2D sonar. You put like a depth bomb on there. You're going to drop that down to the bottom, raise it up until you see that depth bomb right below your transducer, kind of like you would ice fishing. And let's say you're seeing the fish at 12 to 14 feet. You want to set that depth 11 and a half feet, like I just touched on, or 10 and a half feet, depending on where you're seeing them in the water column. Being at the right height and the right depth to present that bait in their face is always key. And I tend to fish above them. If the water's really, really clear, I don't dump that bait right in their face. I try to keep it a foot and a half above them. It's amazing how some of these fish will come up 2-3 feet at a time. But you start getting into that 4, 5, 6 feet, they're probably not going to come after it. I mean, I've had them come up and chase it before. But I always think of it this way. If they're feeding on bait, if they're feeding on bugs that are high in the water column, they're going to see your leech. They're going to see your night crawler. Now, varying your colors as far as jig heads, that's up to you. Again, dark and stained water, I tend to use really bright colored jig heads. I like the glow colors. I like the brighter chartreuses, the oranges. It's hard to beat an orange sometimes in that darker water. And so I tend to use those colors. Whereas if I'm on Mille Lacs, tend to use more natural colors, the whites and things like that. Something that's gonna, get their attention, but is not, the bright chartreuse that everybody's used to. And I like to use the VMC hardball jigs, those small little hardballs, 16th ounce, 32nd ounce, something. If you are going down to a 16th or 32nd ounce, it's really important to have something with a little bit longer shank, especially walleye fishing. A lot of these small 16th and 32nd ounce jigs have that really short shank. You want something that's a little bit longer shank on those jigs. Your hookup percentages are going to be way better on that. So that's basically the scheme that I have for bobbers. Not to say that you can't catch them with bobbers when they're on the bottom, but this is the time when basically power corking was invented, is when these bug hatches started to happen. I remember doing it with 2D sonar. I would drive around with my big motor until I ran over a school of fish, and then boom, we put it neutral, pitch it right behind the boat, compensating for basically how fast that 2D sonar was running. And a good depth now, like if you have a forward-facing sonar on a pole, I like to run around at 3 to 4 miles an hour, kind of shooting it out to the side or up front. It's sort of, I'm basically looking from, if you're, the front of my boat is 12 o'clock, I'm looking from 9 o'clock to about 3 o'clock. And I'm just going back and forth, scanning in front of the boats because I don't want to spook these fish. And if it's windy, I use my big motor. If it's not that windy, like today, I was just using the trolling motor, just scanning until you see them. And then boom, dumping that bait right on top of those fish and trying to get that bait right close to them so they can see it. A lot of times it's sort of a reaction strike. They come up, they see it, they smell the bait, or they see the leech moving, and boom, they hit it. This isn't like old school bobber fishing where you're anchored up or spot locking, just sort of fan casting until you catch one. That works sometimes when it's really windy and the fish are fixated on structure. But what I'm talking about are these suspended fish that are off the edge. They're eating bugs. They're kind of pelagic. They're loosely relating to the structure, and they're at varying depths, but they're at the depths in which the bait are pursuing the bugs, and they're also at the depth where the bugs are at, and they're eating bugs. You're going to see some big bug hatches occur all over our big lakes here over the next few weeks. Usually it starts out with the lake fly hatches, and then we move on to, the bigger mayflies, and then you get into the black fly hatch. There's all these bug hatches that occur, and don't get fixated on staying on structure. Find those transition areas, find those areas off a structure where you can kind of hunt down fish. And sometimes the packs of fish were only 1, 2. If I see a great big one, I'll throw on one individual. But most of the time I'm looking for 2, 3, 4 packs. That way it gives you an opportunity. There's a little competition there. You throw on those packs that 3, 4, 5, 6. I mean, we even saw packs today that were upwards of 10, 12 fish at a time. The odds of you getting a bite are going to go up substantially. The more fish that are in the pack, the better you are off, getting that bait in front of them, and one of them's going to strike. Now, what's cool about forward-facing sonar is you can tell pretty quickly if they're going to come up and hit or not. If you throw on them and they're running away from it, then the water's really clear, and I'll actually cast past them and then drag my bait to them and then drop it. And what I mean by that is if they're out at 40 or 50 feet, okay, or 50 or 60 feet, I'll try to throw it to 70 and then drag it back and then slowly dump that bait on top of the fish. It seems to help, especially in spooky fish. Now, today, the spot I was in particular, one of the spots we found, they didn't care. They wanted you to dump it in their face, and they were feeding. It's not like that on all spots. We hit a bunch of spots in the morning where, they were a little spooky. You caught one, it would kind of scatter the rest of the school. But I would say the one consistent I did see on Mille Lacs was there was a lot of suspended fish. And going back to my time on Leech Lake this week, even though we were dumping jigs in their face, there was a lot of fish starting to rise in the water column on some of the reefs, on some of the humps, on some of the rock piles. And yep, it's super clear. I dumped a jig right in the pack, and they were chasing the jig down to the bottom. You can have that too. I've had it where they've been suspended. They won't hit a bobber. A jigging wrap is a good bait to dump in their face. It goes at the bottom. It sort of spooks them sometimes, but then they'll spin right back around and they'll come after that, number 7 jigging wrap as you pop it through them. So I haven't been fishing a ton of jigging wraps yet, but it's always in my boat. I've always got a bunch of jig wraps ready to rock. If I get into a situation where they're not hitting the jigs and plastics, they're not hitting the bobbers, I'll quickly resort to that jigging wrap. Jigging wraps are just magical at certain times of year. I want to dedicate a whole podcast to jig wrapping at some point. I don't want to get totally in the weeds with that. I really wanted to focus in on plastics and bobbers for walleye fishing. And I do want to get into some really great techniques that I love fishing this time of year for smallmouth bass. So we're going to take a quick break. When I come back, I want to dive deeply into some smallmouth fishing that I've done. I'm going to do a few more smallmouth trips here coming up this week. The smallmouth bite is evolving on Mille Lacs, on Leech Lake. Leech Lake's sort of becoming almost that Mille Lacs go-to. There's a lot of other small lakes that are overlooked for smallmouth bass. So if smallmouth are on your radar, stay tuned after this. We're going to get into some in-depth talk about techniques you can use to put a lot of numbers and really good numbers and big post-spawn smallmouth in the boat after this.
Visit Cook County, Minnesota, a year-round fishing destination like no other. Spring brings steelhead and smelt runs along the Lake Superior shoreline. In summer, cast for walleye, lake trout, and northern pike in the region's inland lakes and rivers. As the leaves change, so does the fishing, with fall offering some of the best lake trout action around. When winter settles in, grab your gear and head out for ice fishing in a true northern wilderness setting. Whether you're an experienced angler or just discovering the joy of casting a line, Cook County has a spot and a season for you. Learn more and start planning your fishing trip at visitcookcounty.com.
OnX Fish is the best tool I have ever used for finding new lakes to target. Download the app today to get fisheries information in the state of Minnesota and Wisconsin, along with research tools for serious anglers and beginners alike. Filter lakes by species, trophy only, keeper fish, abundance, or all of the above. Plan which lakes to fish with the app, navigate to the accesses, and once you're there, use the OnX best-in-class weather imagery and fishing hotspots to catch more fish. OnX Fish is a phenomenal tool both on and off the water for discovering new fishing opportunities, many of which you would never known existed. OnX Fish, the app that is changing the game on ice.
Arneson's Rocky Point Resort in northern Minnesota offers a little something for everyone. Nestled on Lake of the Woods' South Shore, it provides easy access to 14 remarkable reefs. Serious anglers know that Arneson's offers some of the best fishing, charter fishing, and small boat fishing options, all supported by the largest protected marina on the lake's South Shore. Accommodation selections range from 1 to 5 bedrooms. Equipped with all the modern conveniences, guests can enjoy a delightful dining experience and stunning lake views at the Rock Harbor Lodge, an on-site full-service bar and restaurant. The two beaches provide hours of fun for the whole family. Whether you're seeking an idyllic fishing spot or a relaxing vacation, Arneson's Rocky Point has everything you need. Check them out at arnesonsresort.com. Okay, in this portion of the podcast, I want to dive into smallmouth bass fishing. It's something that's super passionate for me in June in particular, but all the months of the year. I love smallmouth bass fishing. I've guided for smallmouth bass now for, the better part of 10 to 15 years very consistently. And I've loved smallmouth bass since I've been a kid. I grew up on a lake river system where I caught a ton of smallmouth bass, especially on the river growing up. It seemed to me like, smallmouth bass were kind of niche. You'd catch them in the boundary waters. You'd catch them, up in Canada. When I guided up in Canada, they were kind of a special fish, and they still are today, but they seem to be a lot more widespread. Our rivers have a lot more smallmouth in them. If you fish the Mississippi at all, the upper Mississippi, loaded with smallmouth bass, great resources. If you're a smallmouth angler, you can catch them from shore. You can fish in small boats and crafts. There's a bunch of lakes, around where I live and in northern Minnesota that you can capitalize on smallmouth bass fishing. And it's one of those species that's really thriving right now in northern Minnesota. And then, of course, in Canada. Some of my go-tos over they're always evolving, but especially this time of year, as we get towards post-spawn fish, I'm not a huge bed fisherman. I nothing against bed fishing, but I kind of find it boring. For me, it seems like when you get into May and you start smallmouth fishing and you're just wailing on them on jerk baits, like some of my favorite jerk baits would be X-Wraps, Shadow Wraps, and now the new Mavericks, the Maverick 110 in particular, both the deep diver and the shallow diver. Love jerk bait fishing. And then it seems like jerk baits, hair jigs, swim baits, I throw a lot of paddle tails and I swim them. But unlike walleyes where you're snap jigging, it's more of a pitch and slow retrieve presentation. So like a 4-inch Mayer, it's sort of a slow retrieve, a lighter jig head. So those fish are actually hitting that bait higher in the water column. But as we get into June here, this post-spawn, here's kind of my go-tos. It tends to be more Ned rigs, tubes, things where I'm pitching on fish that are behind boulders. They're up cruising. If I'm finding that a lot of the smallmouth bass are sort of on the bottom and they're behind rocks, they're off the edges where it dumps from rock into sand or those really sharp edges, my go-to is like a Ned rig. I mean, it's hard to beat a Ned. And Crush City makes that Ned BLT. If you've never fished a Ned rig, it's one of the greatest tools in the world. You'll catch everything on it. If you have a small lake, a cabin that you have a place on, or lakes that you like fishing, that you just want to catch everything, it ranks right up there with what I was talking about earlier in the podcast with the paddle tails. The Ned rig is just a small, I love using 1/8 ounce heads, for example, especially in the shallow water June time period. It's just a small mushroom head jig. VMC makes Ned heads. That 1/8 ounce Ned head, either black, green pumpkin, and then just putting that Ned BLT on there and throwing it out there. You can drag it, you can cast it into vegetation, you can fish Neds anywhere, and you're going to catch everything. I've fished them pretty much everywhere I go. My son Robbie's been on the podcast. He loves fishing Neds, and for good reason. It's like one of the top producers when it comes to just catching fish in general. But for me, for a while when I first started fishing Neds, I didn't want to tell anybody because it was so effective. It was like you went from okay fishing to having just unbelievable days. And what's cool about those Crush City baits is they're very buoyant. So that bait's going to stand upright. You couple that with that VMC Ned head, it's a win-win. You're going to catch fish all over the place. So Neds are always tied up in my boat right now. I still have hair jigs. I love a marabou hair. Same thing, a very light head on there, either a 16th or an 1/8 ounce. Now with the hair, I'm almost always casting it out and then just slow retrieve. But you've got to have the right rod set up for both, okay? If you're throwing a hair jig, for example, I like to use a really light braid, something, like in that 6-pound category. You can use like a nano style braid. There's some new braids coming out from Suffolk right now where you can really huck those baits out there. I tend to use a lighter fluorocarbon with my hair jigs as well. Because I'm not making contact with the bottom, I'm primarily just floating that bait and slowly retrieving. You can drag them as well. I've had a lot of customers that maybe aren't great at casting or don't really want to cast all the time. They want to pitch it out behind the boat and drag. Both the hair jig and the Ned rig, extremely, extremely effective, whether you fish Mille Lacs, whether you fish leech, whether you fish any of these great smallmouth bass bodies of water that we have. And you know what? Both of them are absolutely deadly on largemouth as well. So if you have a lake where you've got both species in there, those are great go-tos. Another thing for me is I still fish the jerk baits, but I tend to downsize my jerk baits, or I'll tend to use, instead of like the deep divers early in the season where I'm trying to get those baits a little bit deeper in the water column to catch bass that are still coming out of those, let's say, deeper wintering areas, but aren't exactly on top. I tend to use shallow runners and smaller profile baits. So the 1-2 combo would be like the shallow running X-Wrap, for example, or the Maverick, where fish are a little more suspended, just like the walleyes. Some of these bass are capitalizing on some of these bug hatches. And so I'm throwing jerk baits, especially in the morning, on fish that are suspended, that might be only a few feet down or are feeding on bait that's at the surface. On calm days, how many times have I driven my boat around? And I'm sure you can relate to this, but how many times have you driven around and seen tons of bait fish at the surface in the mornings? Okay. Those are times where smallmouth bass are feeding on that bait fish. And so I like running subsurface baits like a number 8 X-Wrap or a shallow running jerk bait like a Maverick 110, where I'm throwing it out there and I'm basically twitching that bait right below the surface. Another one that comes to mind would be like the Rapala Ripstop. But really my go-to is kind of in that realm where I'm fishing those baits just subsurface. If you notice where they're chasing, let's say like a Maverick 110, like a bigger profile bait, but they won't quite hit it, that's when I start downsizing to like a number 8 X-Wrap. Okay. And again, it's nice to throw that on some lighter line rather than using like a 10-pound braid or something of that nature. I will downsize to like a 6-pound braid, something that's a little bit lighter. I can get those baits out there. I also will downsize my fluorocarbon. I'll use like an 8-pound fluorocarbon. I can fish those baits a lot more effectively. Now, when you're fishing jerk baits, whether you fish jerk baits for walleyes, for smallmouth bass, adding pauses are key. Now, I fish a jerk bait on a spinning rod. I know a lot of people use casting rods, but for me, it's just easier. I can have better control over those baits by using a spinning rod, but there's no wrong way to do it. I mean, if you grew up, especially people in the South, a lot of bass anglers that fish in the South, they throw jerk baits on casting rods. I take a lot of those clients out, so I have casting rods ready for those clients. A lot of us that grew up in Minnesota, northern Minnesota, we threw jerk baits on a spinning rod. And I always joke around. I always say it's because we watched Al Linder and the crew on In Fisherman fish jerk baits with spinning rods. But it's sort of true. Like my passion and my love for jerk bait fishing came from watching those guys throwing husky jerks. And then when X-Wraps came out, I just fell in love with them. I caught a ton of fish on it. And so a lot of people think of a jerk bait as just a cold water bait, and that's not true. As we get into this time period, this is when jerk baits really shine. When you start to see that bait rise to the surface, when you start to see those bugs rise to the surface, but the surface temperature is still a little cool yet, I like to use something that's subsurface. And so throwing those jerk baits in the mornings is key. Now, if I start seeing fish where they're popping the surface, right, where they're actually hitting the surface, that's when I'll quickly shift into what I'm going to talk about next, and that's topwater. June is probably the best month for topwater fishing, hands down, right? At least for smallmouth anyway. When we come off a post-spawn, those fish start to feed on top. Usually that post-spawn bite coincides with these bug hatches that are occurring. And you don't just have to be on a big lake to see bug hatches occurring. I fish a lot of small lakes that have incredible mayfly hatches, like overwhelming amount of mayfly hatches that are going on. And so that's when the topwater bite starts to kick in. Here are some of my favorite topwaters in June, but topwaters all season long that I like to use. And I'll list them. I don't want to categorize them by like 1 through 5, for example, saying 1 being the best. I'm just listing the ones that I'm using because there's time and a place for all of them. But I'll start with a popper. X-Wrap pops are hard to beat, man. There is something about the noise of that X-Wrap pop. You can really chuck it out there. It's got a loud rattle chamber, and it's got that dress treble on the back. When we are in the early stages of topwater fishing, I always find that dress treble to be worth its weight in gold because those fish really key on that. Smallmouth bass, unlike largemouth, a lot of times will just come up and slurp the bait rather than completely exploding out of the water and jumping out of the water and hitting that bait. They'll kind of slurp it in. And if you give them something to key in on, like that dress treble, your hookup percentages are going to be way, way better. And so X-Wrap pops, that should be in your tackle box, in your arsenal. If you like fishing Mille Lacs, Leech, wherever you like smallmouth bass fishing, the river, poppers are huge, right? But with pops, just like fishing a jerkbait, you've got to add tons of pauses, okay? Early in the season, longer pauses, the better. And so I'll throw that out there, usually long casts. I'll get that bait on the surface. I'll give it one big bloop and let it sit. Bloop, let it sit. And then bloop, bloop. I might give it a couple, but then letting it sit. Adding those pauses, you catch way more fish. If you're not adding those pauses in there, you can't get those fish to come up and strike. They're not chasing it as much like they will, let's say, in 2 to 3 weeks' time. And so pauses on those baits are really, really key. And then again, that dress treble. Now, I will give you a quick tip. Like the deeper you fish popping baits or even walking baits or any surface bait, the longer the pauses, the better. I'll fish them over 10 feet of water sometimes. I'll see fish that'll come out of a nest or a bed and strike a popper towards the end of the nesting season. Or it may be a fish that be adjacent to a boulder that's sitting down near the bottom. I don't even see them on forward-facing sonar. I throw it out there and boom, that fish comes out of 10 feet of water to strike that bait. And so it's amazing to me. If you're adding pauses, that they'll chase it and work the bait all the way back to the boat. I've had smallmouth bass just keying in on it, work it back to the boat, work it back to the boat. Sometimes twitching it a couple times to trigger that strike is key. But I've had those fish strike it right next to the boat. So make sure you're working those baits all the way back to the boat. I get a lot of anglers that cast them out. They pop them a couple times. They get within 20 feet of the boat. They just reel it up and recast. Don't do that. Walk that bait all the way back to the boat, snapping that X-Wrap pop and making that really loud pop all the way back to the boat. Okay. The next walking bait that's always in my tackle box would be a skitter walk. Rapala makes a skitter walk. They've had it for years. I like running skitter walks and walking baits in general. I tend to fish walking baits a little more shallow this time of year where I'm up really, really tight, let's say to the docks, to the banks, or up on a reef where it's really shallow. I can run a walking bait over the top or an edge, especially if those fish are chasing your popper and looking at it but not quite striking. A walking bait is huge. Now, I will say, I'll give you a little tidbit or inside tip that if you're getting fish that are inefficiently feeding on your walking bait, if they're missing it, because it's amazing how big a walking bait you can use. Like Rapala came out with last year with the Rapala Jowler. That thing's monster, right? Smallmouth love it, okay? But a walking bait like that, make sure if they're chasing or they're inefficiently feeding on that and you're missing them, put a dress treble on there. Rapala, VMC make dress trebles that you can put on the back of your baits, put on the back of your skitter walks, and it's going to increase your hookup percentage if they're inefficiently missing your baits, okay? So between the popper, the X-Wrap pop, the skitter walk, the jowler, I would say a close second would be a chug bug. If you've ever fished a storm chug bug, it does have a dress treble, kind of like the X-Wrap Pop. It's a little skinnier profile. But what I like about it, it's got that really loud rattle chamber, and you can kind of walk that bait as well. I mean, it'll walk back to the boat. Extremely effective baits. And then lastly, don't be afraid of using frogs, like a Terminator frog, something. If you're in pencil reeds, they love frogs. And so you'll catch largemouth. Even on big lakes like Mille Lacs, you go to the Leech Lake, other lakes where there's vegetation, where let's say it's rock vegetation. Don't be afraid to use frogs, and don't stop walking those frogs once you get out of the vegetation. Completely continue to work those frogs, even in open water. They'll come up and slam them. I wouldn't say the bug hatch is in 1000% mode yet. They're just coming, but today after fishing those suspended fish, yesterday after being on leech, seeing those suspended fish on other lakes in Brainerd, in the morning when I got up and there was some bugs at the dock, I saw some different lake flies and that sort of thing. The time is now. June is here. The fishing is incredible. There's no wrong way to fish. What I like about this time of year too, you can get up at the crack of dawn. It gets light at 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning. You can get out fishing as early as possible. You have light until 10 o'clock at night if you want to stay out there and fish till then. June is just one of those magical time periods that there's no wrong way to fish. It just is. If you're intrigued or if you want to get better at the techniques that I talked about, that I fish this time of year, this is the time to do it. It really is. And you can do a 1-2 combo. I talked about earlier how, Leech Lake is really coming on as being kind of the next big smallmouth destination. Leech Lake offers a lot of different fishing, just like Mille Lacs. And so you can go out there, fish smallmouths in certain spots, go catch some walleyes. You can find yourself in back bays catching giant largemouth. It's a fun lake to fish. So, if you're going to Mille Lacs, and I should say you can do the same thing on Mille Lacs as well. You can go fish, walleyes on one spot. You can go fish smallmouth bass on the next spot. You go to the next spot, you're catching the largemouth. You just kind of have to seek out those areas. But I always have things ready to roll in my boat so I can do that. Lake of the Woods, another great destination where you can go do a multi-species trip. Even though it feels like a lot of times that you're specifically going up there to fish walleyes, don't overlook a lot of your smallmouth opportunities. Don't overlook some of the largemouth, the panfish, especially if you get into the Canadian side. But all over even the South Shore Lake of the Woods, there's plenty of smallmouth bass to be had on the river, on the Rainy River. Get into Rainy Lake. They're absolutely everywhere. And you know what? If you don't have a boat, you don't have all the expensive gear, you don't want or can't go to some of these bigger destinations, don't overlook some of these smaller river tributary systems. You can fish any of the techniques that I talked about today on any of these smaller river systems and have extreme success. Like I said at the beginning of the podcast, I spent my youth walking up and down river systems, casting from shore, catching tons of smallmouth, catching tons of walleyes, catching tons of pike. When COVID hit, for example, my kids had driven over a lot of these rivers that I grew up fishing, and I was looking for things for them to do. And I told them, I said, hey, let's grab some old tennis shoes. We're going to go down to these rivers and we're going to fish and we're going to walk up and down the bank and we're going to have a great time doing it. And their minds were blown how many fish you'd catch, how many walleyes you'd catch. You throw a paddle tail in the river, you throw a small X-Wrap in the river, you throw an original Rapala floater in the river, you're going to catch something. Inline spinner, a spinnerbait, a topwater, you're going to catch them. These small rivers are chock full of fish. We're so blessed to have all these resources across the Midwest, but particularly in Minnesota, where I guarantee there's a river system by your house that you may have never fished. If you take a kid down there, you just want to go explore on your own, you're going to catch fish in those systems. I can promise you. So don't be intimidated that I don't have a big enough boat to go catch smallmouth on Mille Lacs or Leech or Vermilion or Lake of the Woods like Tony was talking about. You don't need that. You can go to these smaller river systems. And right now, with this year, with the water being a little bit low, it's easier to access these rivers and it's easier to find them because you're going to find them in these pools. You're going to find them pooled up in the deeper water, these cut banks, anywhere there's big boulders. You see a big boulder in the river, you throw it behind there, 9 times out of 10, you're going to catch a smallmouth. So June is a magical time period. You got to get out and get after it. I know for me, like I come home from work, I start thinking of other destinations that I need to check out. I'm constantly on my Onyx maps, looking out, using the filters to filter out what species are in different lakes, whether it be trophy walleye lakes, whether it be smallmouth bass lakes, rivers, using that app to kind of narrow down where my next fishing destination is going to be. It's huge and it's fun. I love looking at maps. I like looking at different resources. It's amazing how many lakes that, let's say, my son and I have found over the last few years just using the Onyx Fish app and going out and trying those destinations. We've done it on ice. We've done it in open water. We've done it walking shorelines. So it's out there. That technology is available. If you don't have it, I highly recommend downloading that Onyx Fish app. It's really going to help you for your next adventure. Go take advantage of June. It's only here for a short time period. Next thing you know, it'll be the 4th of July. You start hearing the doldrums of fishing. You know, you're coming off that June high. I know for me personally, I will be out every possible day I can fishing in June. Weather pending, God willing, but I'm going to take advantage of it. So take advantage of all the great fishing that we have right now. Good luck to you. Hopefully I gave you some insight on kind of my breakdown of baits, what I like doing for walleyes and smallmouth in particular. But most of which I talked about are great multi-species tools. Good luck. We'll talk to you next week. Tune in each and every week. This has been the Dialed In Angling Podcast.